Thank you. I move around a little bit, so I don't like stand up. Look, if I stood behind this podium, I would be a podium with arms. So we're not going to do that. I'm excited about being here. I really missed you guys last year. I'm glad. How many of you have heard me teach before? Okay, so let's do this in the opposite. How many of you have never heard me teach before? All right, well, I'm excited to be here, and I hope you're excited too. I'm here to teach you about the founding principles of the Constitution. The Constitution is under attack in America. And one of the most vicious attacks that we see in America against the Constitution is about its foundation. You hear people say, well, it's not relevant today because the Constitution was written 250 years ago. You know, they didn't have internet, and they didn't have cell phones, and they didn't have AR-15s. So how could they have possibly written a document that long ago that really means something to us today? Another way they attack the Constitution is to say, well, you know, the Constitution was written by a bunch of rich, white, slave-owning men who simply wanted to enslave the population and victimize the women. But we're going to talk about that this week. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you this week why that is absolutely not true, but a vicious lie to not only destroy the Constitution, but to deprive you of a history that provides enormous lessons. Now, we bring to you the Constitution from an historical perspective and how the Constitution is supposed to be taught. We have Liberty First University. You see my t-shirt, Liberty First University, which is an online teaching program. And we teach the Constitution at a level that everybody can understand. Yes, I'm a lawyer, but I don't teach in legalese. Okay, so our students at Liberty First University are ages 6 to 106. And it's because we provide an education on the Constitution that you cannot find anywhere else. And I don't say that out of arrogance, I say that out of reality. And what we end up doing then is supplementing the textbooks that you have, both in homeschooling, public schooling, and private schooling, and, am I right, often correcting them, because we don't teach the truth. Now, what we're going to be doing today, like I said, is teaching you the principles of our Constitution. Our Constitution is based on a foundation of what we call axiomatic truths. Now, an axiomatic truth is a truth that proves itself over time. How many of you have read the Declaration of Independence lately? Uh-oh, shame on you. You're at Camp Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is part of that foundation that creates the Constitution. And the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's another term for axiomatic truth. It is a self-evident truth because it has proven itself to be true over time. Our Constitution is not something that a bunch of guys invented in 1787. Our Constitution took 700 years to write. It was built upon 5 foundational documents. These documents I call the genealogy of the Constitution. Who can tell me what a genealogy is? Yeah? What is it? Say that again? Kind of, yeah. It's exactly a family tree. A genealogy is the family tree. These 5 documents are the family tree to our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. And here we have, oh look, I can fix this now because I can see the whole slide. Make it square. Anybody else like square things better? All right, so this is a quote from Alexander Hamilton. He says, this truth is, after all the declamations we have heard, the Constitution itself, and in every sense, rational sense, and to every useful purpose is a Bill of Rights, He says the several bills of rights in Great Britain form its constitution. And when he says the several bills of rights in Great Britain, he's talking about these 5 documents. Now, I want everybody, when I'm teaching, you don't have to raise your hand. Just shout out the answer for me. And right now, what I want everybody to do, adults and students alike, just shout out the name of the first founder that comes to your mind. I got to hear you up here, so you got to be louder. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin. Do you know something? These people, this might be shocking, were not Americans. Right? Because before 1776, there were no Americans. Everybody who lived in the colonies of America were actually British subjects. Our Constitution is an evolution of British Constitution and law. And that's what the first part of what we're going to talk about today. Remember, we're learning the foundational principles of our Constitution. It is not an invention. It is a lesson throughout history full of experiences that ought to be teaching today. How many of you have heard the phrase, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat? Let's fix that a little bit, because one thing we're going to learn today is that history always repeats. But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Now, we're not taking any questions, so you'll have to hold those to the end. Doomed to repeat their mistakes. I want you to think about this, because I guarantee even our adults here in this room, unless they've heard it from me, have not been taught this history. And the question that I have for you is, who benefits by you not knowing this? If history is our teacher, who benefits for you to remain ignorant of this history? Now, the history that builds these 5 documents that begins with our Constitution begins in 1014 on an island that is not called England. It is not called Great Britain because they don't exist yet. In 1014, the island is occupied in its southern portion by a people called the Anglo-Saxons. And right now, in 1014, in this little piece of history, the Anglo-Saxons have no king. Now, just before this, they were ruled by a Danish king, and when the Danish king died, they resisted the king's rule. They said, we don't want foreign kings ruling over our people, because foreign kings are not attached to the people, which makes them not regard the rights of the people. So if you've got somebody ruling you from a foreign land, they don't care about your property, do they? They don't care whether you're happy or not. What do they care about? Power, money, right? All of those things are contrary to the people's rights. So the Anglo-Saxons right now are governing themselves in small communities, like your counties or your boroughs. And they're doing a really good job, but they're having a couple problems. Now, I know you guys are working on the preamble to the Constitution, right? Anybody got it memorized yet? Now, I have it memorized, but you guys are learning a new song, right? How many of you have it memorized because you memorized the school of, what is, how's it? Schoolhouse Rock. I was like, the Schoolhouse Rock song. Anybody got that one? Yeah? You do? You do? All right, come on up here. Both of you, come on. We're going to sing it together.
Oh, crap, I just sing it. Can I just say it?
No, we're going to sing it. Do you hear how loud I speak? Nobody's going to hear you. You can sing with me. Ready? But you're going to have to at least move your lips, because then they'll know you're not singing. Okay? Ready? Schoolhouse Rock, right?
Yes.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. Some of them lied to us, didn't they? You guys were the only ones that raised their hand, and everybody out here is singing this song. Shame on you. All right, everybody sing it together. How does it go?
Oh, wait.
Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution of these United States of America. Give me a hand. Yeah, you guys can go sit down. So I want you to remember those words, because remember, we're learning that our Constitution is not an invention, but a creation from lessons in history. And in 1014, the Anglo-Saxons are doing a really good job governing themselves, but they're having a couple problems. One of their biggest problems is that they're still being attacked by foreign kings. Now in 1014, if you're the sentinel and you're in your high tower and you're watching and you see the king's men marching your way, you're not picking up your cell phone and texting the neighbor, right? Because it's 1014. So what they're having a hard time doing is what? Providing for their common defense. Now, if you want to provide for your common defense, one of the greatest ways, one of the best ways to keep peace with a foreign kingdom is to have treaties with that kingdom. Now, in 1014, treaties are made when one king sits down and talks to another. But remember, the Anglo-Saxons don't have a king. How many of you think that a king's going to want to sit down and talk to another, just anybody? Is that going to happen? No. So they can't make treaties, they can't organize for their common defense, so they realize they need a central government for that. Now they fall back on the only thing they've ever known, a king. And they go to this man named Ethelred. And they say to Ethelred, we need a king. Now you're Anglo-Saxon, you're like us, you live with us, you have the same beliefs and you have the same principles that we have, so we'll make a deal with you. We will allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job is to help us organize for our common defense and to take care of all of our foreign negotiations. You, Mr. King Ethelred, will leave us alone to continue to govern ourselves the way that we have been. And what we're doing now is we're creating actually a brand new kind of kingdom called a limited monarchy, because the king's power is limited by the will of the people. Now what's interesting is, if we'd been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 150 years, you would already see an historical connection. Because how many of you heard of a guy named James Madison? Anybody know what nickname history has given James Madison? Yeah? Bravo, father of the Constitution. Now James Madison wrote a document we call Federalist 45. He says the powers delegated to the federal government will be exercised principally upon foreign affairs. And then he names them: war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. He says all other powers, the internal order, the improvement, the prosperity of the states, the liberties, the lives, the properties of the people will all be reserved to the states. That is the foundation. That is the first building block for our Constitution. Limited and defined government, where the sole purpose of our central government is for foreign affairs. The states are to be left alone to govern themselves. And we didn't invent it. We inherited it. Now from this, we have to move forward about 30 years to this guy, this king. His name is Edward the Confessor. Now the people love Edward because they say Edward is a generous king. And now we see the problems that can develop when even the best intentions happen when we create government. Under the Ethelred Agreement, does the king have the authority to be generous? No, right? But look how far we've come in just 30 years. Why? Because human nature kicks in. How many of you heard of a guy named Solomon? Solomon said there is nothing new under the sun. Why? Because human nature never changes. We've already, in just 30 years, left behind our limited and defined government. Why? Because people like free stuff. Am I right? And when the king is handing out free stuff, the people don't ask where it comes from or what it might cost them later. Now, Edward's about to die and he has no son, which means the next in line to be king is his cousin, William I. But the Anglo-Saxons don't want William to be their king. Why? Because William is not Anglo-Saxon. William is from Normandy, and Norman kings are not limited and defined. Norman kings are like the kings you see on TV, right? I say, you do, or else. And they don't want this guy. Now, under this new form of limited government, they have said, we may not have to inherit a king, we can choose our king instead. Through an elected body called the Wittens, they choose this man, Harold Godwinson, to be king. Now, he has no birthright to be king, but the people have chosen him because he was Edward's best friend and he's a rich guy. They're pretty sure he's going to be generous too. But now we have a conflict, don't we? Because William believes he has a right to be king. Which is bad news for the Anglo-Saxons because William has a nickname. He is called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? What's he going to do? Conquer. So William raises up his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people in a very famous battle called the Battle of Hastings. And now William is king. Now, William does not want to rule in a limited and defined manner. He wants to be that king. But he also recognizes that he's not very popular with the people, right? Because he's had to, conquer them. Now, as a king, he has the authority to write laws. They're called decrees. He could, as king, step up and write a law that says, hey, we're not going to be under Anglo-Saxon rule anymore because I'm king. We're going to be Norman rule. We're going to operate under Norman law. We're going to do things the way I say. But he realizes that's not a very good idea. Because remember, they don't like him. Now let me ask you a question. If you live in a kingdom in 1066 and you don't like your king, do you start looking for a new candidate to run against him in the next kingly election? No. What do you have to do?
Off their head.
What's that? Say it again. Kill him, right. You raise up a rebellion and you chop off his head. William knows this and he wants to keep his throne and his head at the same time. So instead of issuing a decree to change the laws, William decides it will be better for us to fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that the people don't realize the laws are being changed. How do you do that? Well, William knew. You change out the judges in the legal system with judges who are loyal to the king and not loyal to the law. So then the judges will say from the bench, this is the law, even when it's not. They'll bring his foreign law into the courtrooms and help him take the property from the people. You see, if you are a king and you know people don't like you and you want to stop a rebellion, the best way to keep down a rebellion is to get rid of all the people who don't like you. So now with all these judges on the bench, with this new law being used, he can use the force of law and the force of government to chase everybody out of the kingdom that doesn't like him. What are you going to do, right? You're going to make sure that nobody that hates you is here. Now, when the land becomes abandoned, the ownership of the land goes back to the king. So now he owns all the land that he just chased the people after, and he starts bringing in his friends to control that land, because you now get rid of the people you hate, bring in the friends, you got no rebellion. All of this takes place over a period of about 40 years through the reign of William II first and his son William II. Now William II is only going to rule for about 13 years because William II and his little brother Henry I are going to go hunting together. And William is killed in a mysterious hunting accident, which makes his brother Henry king. Anybody here believe this was an accident? No, it was not. So Henry is now king, and Henry realizes that the people are not happy with him. You know, it's true they didn't like his brother William, but you see, they also recognize that if Henry will murder his own brother to become king, what will the value of the lives of the people be? Right? So Henry has to do some things to appease the people. The most important thing Henry is going to do, remember those 5 documents that I told you about? Henry's going to write the first of the 5. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. This 1100 Charter of Liberties establishes there are boundaries for government. There are things the government can and cannot do, because if the government engages in these activities, the people will know they have an evil and oppressive government, and they will be righteously justified to resist that government. One of these things that Henry said was evil and oppressive was when the heirs of an estate have to pay the government before they can receive their inheritance. Does that sound familiar to anybody? What is that called in America? Death tax. Let me tell you, this king in 1100 who had no cell phone, right, knew that inheritance tax was the mark of an evil and oppressive government, but we allow our government to call it revenue. Are you beginning to see that maybe there's a reason we're not taught this history? Well, the second document in our history of our Constitution is the Magna Carta of 1215. This comes after a rebellion against a king named John, who was the most vicious, evil, wicked taxation king that the English people will ever know. But from the Magna Carta, we get a royal council, the beginning of legislation through representation. Not only that, through clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta, we get our Constitution's provisions of due process and property rights. Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments all come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. Can I get a glass of water? Not only that, Clause 61 is where our understanding of the duty of the sheriff comes from, and a very important part of our First Amendment. Now this is Camp Constitution, so I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Excuse me, missed my mouth. To yourself, not out loud, don't even whisper or lip sync. I want everybody in this room to name all 5 liberties of the First Amendment. See, if you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? And if you can't define your rights, how are you going to defend them? The Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is where we get the 5th aspect of our First Amendment, the right of the people to petition for a redress of grievances. The 3rd document moving through history is called the Petition of Right of 1628. This is where we reassert to the government that due process is a right and not a privilege that the government can give and take away based upon their needs. There is no national security override of your right to due process. It is a natural right. This is also where the people declared there'll be no martial law unless we're actually at war, being invaded by the enemy, and a very important part of our Bill of Rights, no quartering of soldiers. How many of you know where that comes from? Anybody? If you don't know what your rights are, how in the world are you going to defend them? Our fourth document in the history of our Constitution is another one against Charles I. This one is the Grand Remonstrance of 1649. In this document they say, the root of all this mischief of past kings can be found in a malignant and pernicious design. And then they outline this design. They look, we've been watching government now for about 600 years, and we're noticing a pattern. Corruption of the courts, infiltration of foreign law, control over the message of the church, violation of due process and property rights, fiat money, and disarming the people while the government remained armed. In 1641, they're already describing the condition that we see in America today. Why? Because we have been denied the lessons of history. The final document in the history of our Constitution is the English Bill of Rights. Comes from a battle against this King James II. A battle, by the way, over separation of church and state. A battle to keep the government from defining religious liberty. And in this, we have the king being accused of writing law refused to be written by Parliament. You know, if Parliament will not legislate, I will. We have the king overturning law properly ratified by Parliament. We have the king setting aside law for political favors and advantages. And what we're describing here is a violation of separation of powers. What James Madison said would be the complete destruction of liberty. These are the fundamental principles of our Constitution. They are not invented, they are inherited, based on 700 years of history, struggle, and written laws. You see, it is a fixed standard, not a living, breathing document. And law proves that as well as history. You see, a kingdom which they did not create, right? We're not the kingdom of America. How many of you remember hearing that there were people begging George Washington to be king? That's how close we were to becoming a kingdom. But they didn't want a kingdom because a kingdom is controlled by those in power. And the people have no rights unless the king gives them to you. And if the king is giving, what can he do? A kingdom is a living, breathing government. They created a constitutional republic where the Constitution is the standard in writing, where it is a mechanism to change it, but it's difficult, it is cumbersome. So we're not flipping and flapping by societal whims and popular opinions or by those in power. A constitutional republic is not a living, breathing government. And we are not a democracy. How many of you heard America called a democracy? We are not a democracy, and that is not a slip of a tongue or a matter of semantics. A democracy is another form of kingdom. The only difference between a kingdom and a democracy is how many people rule over you. In a kingdom, how many people rule over you? One. In a democracy, it's mob rule. So whoever has all the power, whoever has all the money, who has all the influence, they rule over the minorities. And in a democracy, minority groups have nothing unless the majority says so. So if you live in a democracy and the majority is handing out to the minority, what can they do? Take it away. Minority groups never have anything in a democracy. A democracy is simply a return to slavery. It is another form of living, breathing government. Our Constitution is fundamental. It is not optional. It is a standard fixed in place. These guys weren't making this up as they go along. You've already seen the 700 years of history that made these principles, that ingrained them in them. Let's talk about this understanding of original intent. How many of you heard this phrase, original intent? Right? It is under attack. We have people in media, politicians, even law professors who are saying we can't have original intent because original intent is a return to slavery. It is the exact opposite. It is the original intent that keeps you free. Let's look at this real quick. The Constitution is a contract. If you don't understand the Constitution being a contract, we have this book over here that teaches you all about the contract of the Constitution. Look at what James Madison says. He says the powers of the federal government as resulting from the compact, which is another word for a contract. He says, limited in their plain sense and intention of the instrument constituting the compact. Over and over and over again, our founders referred to the Constitution as a contract. This is how we know original intent must be applied by contract law. Because contract law, the first principle of contract law says it is the intent of the writers of the contract that prevails over any other interpretation. It's how you know what the contract means, by what the writers wanted it to mean. A contract is not a living, breathing document. How many law professors, politicians, or judges or lawyers do you think would like to have their employment contract to be a living, breathing document? But they want the supreme contract of the land to be interpreted like that. Why? Because they're either ignorant or they're deceiving you for a different purpose. I want you to see this. The drafters demand original intent. This is Alexander Hamilton. He says, there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of delegated authority contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised. That word means our intent. Any act of the federal government that is contrary to our intent, Hamilton is saying, is null and void, just as the words themselves. Original intent is freedom. Original intent says all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Everyone is equal under the eyes of the law. And government is established to protect our rights, not to regulate them. Original intent is liberty and justice for all. A living, breathing document puts people in power over you. We are not ruled by a mob mentality, original intent says. We are governed by the consent of the people. However, a living, breathing constitution is arbitrary. It is slavery. It says that the government is dependent upon current social trends. How many of you know that slavery was a social trend? Right? How many of you know that oppression of women is a social trend? That denial of rights is a social trend. How many of you know that in America there was a social trend to put all Japanese Americans, man, woman, and child, into internment camps without any due process at all? Do you know they stayed there for 4 years? That is a social trend. A living, breathing document says that's okay because everybody thinks it's okay. But an original intent document says that's not okay because we have a standard that says all people get due process. We have a standard that says we are not ruled by the rich. We are not ruled by the powerful. That government is limited and defined. How many of you heard of a banana republic? That's what a living, breathing government is. We are not a living, breathing government. We are a government based on standard that has meaning, that has applied intent. And you know the crazy thing is, every time we leave the Constitution's standard, we have chaos. We have disorder. We have government out of control. Our federal government today exercises more power than kings of 1689 because we have failed to teach the right things for a very, very long time. I'm hoping that this week we will get acquainted with what our Constitution really is and the limited and defined nature of who we are. We must have a living, breathing, an original intent Constitution. Otherwise, we will have a living, breathing tyranny. A living, breathing slavery. I have a better slide than this. There it is.
Yay!
How many of you have heard of Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass is going to explain to you probably better than I could why the Constitution is not a living, breathing document, but one based on original intent. Look at what he says. The doctrine in question, meaning living, breathing document, makes the government superior to and independent of the Constitution. How many of you are familiar with the Supremacy Clause? Article 6, Clause 2. Does not make the federal government supreme. It does the exact opposite. The Supremacy Clause makes the federal government inferior to the Constitution. And it makes every act that the federal government engages in contrary to the Constitution null and void. And that's what Frederick Douglass is telling you. When the federal government is not bound by the constraints of the Constitution, then you have to admit that it's superior to the Constitution, right? He says, without which the government is nothing better than a lawless mob. What's another word for a lawless mob? Say that louder for me. Okay, you guys can be louder than that. Come on. Democracy. Remember, we are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. Why? Because a democracy is a lawless mob not constrained by the Constitution. He says, this government will be acting without any authority without any other higher authority than its own conviction and impulses. Isn't that what a king does? You see, a living, breathing government is a kingdom. It is a ruling mob. It is a lawless mob. He says, they will work on these convictions and impulses as to what is right or wrong. Let me just remind you that the Supreme Court of the United States believed that it was right to call people property. It was not the Constitution that called people property. It was the Supreme Court who called people property. It was the President of the United States that thought it was right to put Japanese Americans, men, women, and children in jail for 4 years without due process. Our government has engaged in its own opinions of right and wrong because we have been denied the history of our Constitution and the instruction on our Constitution to make sure that it stays within its boundaries. Let's finish up with what he says. If this doctrine be sound, meaning if we have a living, breathing Constitution, it is a mere farce to have a written Constitution at all. Why would our framers go to the trouble of putting a Constitution in writing if it doesn't mean what it says? Does that make sense to everybody? He says, if the government can override and violate its Constitution in one point, it may do so in all. And I think if there's one principle that we take away from today, it's that final word from Frederick Douglass. One violation of the Constitution accepted means there is no limit to federal power at all. Because we have a problem in America. Even people who we consider conservative ask the federal government to do things it's not entitled to do. For example, farm subsidies. Subsidizing farmers and ranchers may feel good, but the federal government does not have the power to do that. And if we allow the federal government to escape the boundaries of the Constitution because it feels good, then what you're giving them permission to do is to do whatever they want, even if it feels bad to you. How many of you know that health care by the federal government is not constitutional? But when we subsidize farmers and we're okay with that, then we make it okay to subsidize health insurance. You see how that works? How many of you heard of the Defense of Marriage Act? The federal government has no authority in the Constitution to define marriage. Some people think that feels good. But remember, just because it feels good doesn't make it constitutional. And if the federal government can define marriage on Christian terms today, what if they change their mind tomorrow and define it on some other terms? You've already given them permission. That's why our Constitution must be the standard. That's why we must know the standard to keep the government within the standard. Because if the government is not kept by the people in this standard, you live in a kingdom. So my final question for your lesson today is, who do you want to be? How many of you want to be slaves? Then follow the Constitution. How many of you want to be oppressed? If you don't want to be oppressed, then keep the government to the Constitution. You must know the Constitution. How many of you want to be free? Okay, how many of you want to be free? Shout it out. How many of you want to have your rights intact? How many of you want a limited government? You can do it. But you gotta know the limits. And you gotta have the courage and the virtue to enforce those limits, no matter what political party or favorite person you might think is in office. So promise me this week, everybody, all eyes up here, promise me this week that you will do everything that you can to learn and understand the limits of the federal government under our Constitution. Because guess what? You might not be thinking about it now, but one day you will have families. One day you will have children. And if you don't keep the government limited and defined, it's your children who will be the slaves. Thank you, guys. God bless you.